Hi everybody, thank you for connecting with me today. Appreciate you giving me a few minutes of your day, and I hope you've had a good week. Trust that you're doing good. So last week we started our series that we're asking this question, general question: are you strong enough? For things that arise in life, do you have the strength, do you have the resources to deal with them? And the honest answer is that for most of life, we are strong enough. When problems arise, we have the intellectual ability to kind of figure it out. We have the financial resources to pay for something. We have friends to lean on to help us, in times of need, right? For most of the things in life, we are strong enough to be able to figure it out. But then there are things that come along that are bigger than us, that go beyond our resources, that we need a bit of help. And maybe it's a medical diagnosis or some kind of relationship issue where we don't have any control over the situation. There are lots of things in life that we are not strong enough to be able to deal with, and therefore we lean on a higher power, right? And especially when it comes to spiritual issues, you know that we're a whole being, body, mind, and spirit. And so we pay attention to our physical health, for our body, we pay attention to our emotional and mental health, but our spiritual health, when we start talking about our spiritual health, there are things that we can do to help us be, healthy spiritually. But we really depend on God, don't we, for that? And we depend on God's Spirit to help us to be whole and healthy spiritually. And, the reality is that I think, at least from my perspective, that in North America, we tend to pay more attention to tangible things that we can see, smell, taste, hear, and touch. Is that five senses? We tend to pay more attention to tangible things, and I think that that we don't pay as much attention to spiritual things as much as maybe other cultures around the world that are much more in tune spiritually, right? Anyways, so the truth is that we have this spiritual being, and we also have the enemy of our soul. His name is Satan, who his goal is to steal, kill, and destroy. And we're engaged in this, in Paul's language, we're engaged in a spiritual battle, right? Ephesians 12. Ephesians 6, verse 12, Paul says, we're not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers of this dark world, and against evil spirits in the heavenly places. Paul is identifying here that there is this spiritual element to our lives, and there is this spiritual kind of battle that's going on. And Paul says here in a previous verse that I'm going to read in just a second, he says that we can actually be strong on that spiritual level. We can be strong, we can stand our ground. In fact, backing up to verse 10 of Ephesians 6, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on all of God's armor so you'll be able to stand firm against all the strategies of the devil. Keyword strategies of the devil. I'll come back and talk about in a second. For we're not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers of this dark world, against evil spirits in the heavenly places. Okay, so keyword strategy. So the big question that I want to talk about today, and we'll talk about in our around the tables on Sunday, is if the enemy of our soul, who wants to steal, kill, and destroy, if he has strategies, what are his strategies, and how can we defend against them? How can we be strong? How can we stand firm, like Paul's language? And so then Paul answers the question in the following verses. In verse 13, he says, therefore, which ties back, of course, to the previous verses about being strong. And he says, therefore, put on every piece of God's armor so you'll be able to resist the enemy in the time of evil. And then after the battle, you'll be standing firm. And then Paul goes on in verses 14 and the following verses to list some pieces of armor that help us defend against the things that the enemy tries to use against us, right? And the first thing that Paul talks about is in verse 14. He says, stand your ground, putting on the belt of truth. The belt of truth. And then he goes on to say, in the body armor of God's righteousness, that we'll talk about next week. Okay, belt of truth. The first thing that Paul talks about is this issue of truth. Have you ever heard the saying that the first casualty of war is the truth? When you have two sides that are fighting, maybe a physical war like Gaza, or some kind of war of words or whatever. Both sides are posturing, and really you can't believe what anybody says because they're posturing and trying to win kind of the battle for public opinion, right? The first casualty of war is truth. And I think that's a very true statement when we're talking about this battle for our soul. And the enemy of our soul, Satan, is the father of lies, right? John 8:44 says, Satan has always hated the truth because there is no truth in him. When he lies, it's consistent with his character, for he is a liar and the father of lies. So in other words, when Satan, if his mouth is moving, then he's not telling the truth. He's telling a lie, right? And can I just say that for me, the most dangerous lies that the enemy tells me are half-truths that are manipulated to help me to try to get me to believe a lie. Like if Satan comes along and says, whatever, like 2 + 2 = 20, then I go, well, no, that's not true, right? Or if Satan comes along and says, I think you should murder that person, then I go, well, that's just a crazy thought, right? But the things that are most damaging and the things that are most dangerous to me personally are when he manipulates half-truths, right? And I'm going to talk about a few of these things in just a moment here. Manipulating partial truths to get us to believe something that's not true. So let's talk about a couple examples. In our culture, what are the messages that we are told, that we're bombarded with in our culture, that get us to believe something that's not true? I think when I think about our culture and the messaging, I think about consumerism being a really big deal. And the message of consumerism is, if you buy this thing, then you're going to be happy. And there's a partial truth to that, right? Because when we buy new stuff, especially stuff that's novel or like whatever, then we're happy for the first little while, right? And it's fun and it's really cool to get like, whatever, right? But but that only lasts for a little while, and then we're back to the way we used to be. So the message is, buy this and you'll be happy. And there's a bit of truth to that, but that lends itself and leans into and leads us to buy into this consumerism idea, mentality, that we need this in order to be happy. And that's simply not the truth. And that idea is actually damaging to our soul, right? It's damaging to our person, our whole person, body, mind, and spirit. Or what about the lies that the enemy tells us about ourselves, right? What about the messages that lean into fear and anxiety? What about the messages that say that there's danger lurking around the corner and you better watch out for this because this is going to hurt you, whatever that might be, right? And there may be truth to that. There might be something that is kind of lurking out there that could actually turn bad, and it could be not pleasant, right? There could actually be danger out there, but the manipulation, the half-truth of the enemy is that thing is coming to get you, and when it turns bad, you're not going to survive it. You know what I mean? But the voice of truth, the voice of God, the voice of Jesus says, yeah, sure, there might be some, something dangerous out there, but even if that happens, and even if the worst case scenario happens, we can deal with that together. And if you stand, in my love and my grace and my strength, we can deal with that together, right? So these messages that the enemy sends us that manipulate half-truths, that are damaging to our soul? Or what about the messages that we receive about ourselves, maybe even things that messages we've received about ourselves that go back to childhood, that affect the way that we view ourselves, and maybe even we see ourselves as somewhat less than or unlovable in some way or whatever, right? And the enemy uses those messages to damage us, when the truth is that every single human being has been created as a beautiful creation of God. We have been created in His image, the Imago Dei. We've been created to live with courage and creativity and compassion and connection. We've been created to live all of this beautiful stuff. We've been created to live with love and joy and peace and goodness and rightness. We have been created in God's image as a beautiful creation. And so when the lie of the enemy comes along and says, you're less than, you're not lovable in some way, or you're damaged in some way, that we can listen instead to the voice of the Spirit that says you are loved, right? What about the lies that the enemy tells us about God? Right? There's I think a predominant message about God is that He's some deity kind of off in the heavens somewhere, and He doesn't really care about me. He's not really involved in my daily life. And listen, there's a half truth to that. That the truth is that God is like a grand deity that is sovereign over all creation and over all history, and He is this really big deal, right? But it's also true that he's very big and grand, but it's also true He's very loving and personal and intimate, and loves you and I. He loves us personally and intimately, right? So these messages that the enemy tries to get us to believe that damage our soul. And listen, here's my, I guess maybe my homework for you, or something that I'd like you to think about over the next couple of days. We're all bombarded by messages all day long, right? And as we receive messages, let's do two things. First, let's put up the filter of truth and ask ourselves, is this true? This message that I'm receiving about myself or about whatever, is there truth to this? Or is it maybe a half-truth that's being manipulated to get me to believe a non-truth, right? Is there truth to this? That's the first thing. Put up the filter of truth. And then the second thing is to invite Jesus to speak His truth into the situation. So maybe I'm feeling, I don't know, like anxious, or I'm feeling bummed out about, something like whatever. But as I invite the voice of the Spirit, He breathes life and joy and peace and goodness and love into the situation. And that message that I was receiving all of a sudden takes a different form because I'm listening to the voice of the Spirit, okay? So around the tables on Sunday, we're going to have a conversation about this. What are some of the messages that you tend to hear, about yourself, about culture, about God, whatever? What are the messages that you hear, and how do we apply the voice of the Spirit? How do we listen to Jesus's voice of truth in its place? Okay, good. So if you can be with us on Sunday, look forward to it. Food will be served at 10:30, and then we'll begin at 11 with a bit of worship and discussion around the tables. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks for joining me.